teaching you how to juggle. At what point did you think you could make a career of circusing?
Well, I never really thought I could make a career out of it. I just, a job came up, and then another job came up. Well, I know it, that's the only job I'm doing. And then, of course, when getting involved with the stream, on the Northwest Coast and creating that community here, being part of creating that community here, really, really solidified my love and passion for it. And I think that's
So we
really
have
about,
chickpeas,
And of course, you are
bottom of
years up there
a cos lettuce,
Slipstream is celebrating 20 years.
Yeah.
cheese,
I guess
broccolini,
to ignite that
red bell pepper,
for everything
grapes,
you can do in a circus.
carrot, coriander, with some lettuce.
Around the country and overseas as well. And really the fabric of the and vibrancy you don't really get in towns without a circus, really. And it's it's part of the cultural fabric, it's part of what makes Northwest Coast what it is 250 people coming through that post-COVID, it's like around 210, which is remarkable, really. It just goes to show how important, this sort of alternative, non-competitive, creative endeavour can really attract people and really ignite a passion for the physical and the creative rolled in one.
Are you ever too old to start circusing? Like, do you only help young people start, or can anyone start?
Never too old. Because look, I've thought juggling not just for people in their 90s. So it's a too old question. You're never too old to throw on, a bit of music and have a juggle, and people will clap you. They'll get, wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. I will be one of those people cheering along. Kane Pedersen, who you're hearing from, talking about 20 years of Slipstream Circus in the northwest of the state. What brought you back to Slipstream for this 20-year celebrations?
I think it really came down all the time. Invited Steph and I back in town to come back and help make this event happen, and we said yes. Tasmania will help fund all the event as well, and it really was about how do I put it, like What is in the works then for this 20-year celebration, or is it all like a closely guarded secret? No. Look, the kids they're going through a lot of training, and we're so lucky at the moment here. We're so lucky at the moment because of COVID, a lot of the alumni from Slipstream over the 20 years are coming back, and so we've got Jack Fisher who had to cancel his contract in Vegas and to come back, and we got Anna Fisher who came back from Berlin. You got Nicola Zotti was touring overseas with every other year from Australia. We got Bo Gutting, who's the ex-circus rigger, and Will Campbell used to be in Moscow Circus. There's so many alumni around at the moment, and that have all gone on to professional careers, and so these guys they're basically getting so much information overload and training overload, and which is so lucky for them, because then the show will represent that. The skill will represent that as well. Pretty incredible. So 2 performances on the 12th. Do people get to book? Do people just turn up? You need to book because of COVID restrictions, so you're going to have to jump onto try booking. But the best way to do that is just to go onto the Slipstream website. So just type in Slipstream Circus into the Google search or whichever browser you're using, and and it'll come up and that'll direct you through to the try booking website. So it's a free event. No one, part of the giving back to the community. community that has supported us over so many years. But yes, you do have to get a book.
Sounds like it's going to be quite the extravaganza with so many alumni coming back from, as you say, all around the world. I, for one, am very excited about it. Kane, thank you so much for sharing it on the program this afternoon.
Most welcome, most welcome.
Kane Peterson, who, as you've been hearing along with his wife, are currently directing a circus show for the 20-year celebration of Slipstream Circus in the northwest of the state. Does circusing have some kind of, like, it just appeals to the inner child, I think, in you. There's something about growing up with that myth of running away to the circus. It seems somehow very glamorous, although I'm sure it is actually a lot of hard work, but certainly sounds fun as well. About 8 minutes away, well, actually exactly 8 minutes away from news at 6 o'clock. Today's word of the day as well, don't forget, absquatulate. What do you think that might mean? If you have any thoughts, 0467922917. Jerry says absquatulate, involuntary expulsion of methane gas during physical exercise. Yep, I will pay that, Jerry. That is absolutely what it sounds like. Thank you for that. If you think you know what it means, I would love to hear from you. We'll find out what it does in fact mean in just a moment.
If you're not going through an emergency situation right now, it might be the perfect time to explore the all-new ABC Emergency website. ABC Emergency lets you search for incidents near you, or you can check on other locations around the country. There's also a handy button that lets you listen to the local ABC radio station closest to the emergency, abc.net.au/emergency. Save it in your favourites now, and keep listening to ABC Radio, your emergency broadcaster.
I still want you when you're grooving. I sift the water from the bottom of a pool. You're moving without moving, and when you move, I move. You are a cold emotion. Get all of you a virgin, perfect view, like Jonah on the ocean. When you move, I move. When you move, I put your mind of all that I want to be. When you move, I can never define all that you are to me. Stop moving, baby. Shake like the bottom of a willow tree. You do it naturally. Baby. You are the right of movement. It's using to make Lucy and cool. I know it's no improvement. When you move, I move. You're asking for the leaving. All for the sleep in sequence. Only you're atlas and it's sleeping. And when you move, I move. When you move, I can recall something that's gone from me. When you move, honey, I'm putting on something so flawed and free. So moving, baby, sing like the bottom of a willow tree. You do it naturally, moving, baby. So moving, baby. Like it's nothing left to prove, but nothing of you.
Hosier Movement is the song at 3 to 6. Today's word of the day, fun to say, give it a try, absquatulate. What do you think it might mean? Taking last minute suggestions. I do quite like Jerry's suggestion though, being an involuntary expulsion of methane gas during physical exercise. But I suppose we should find out what it does in fact mean. Absquatulate means to leave abruptly. So I absquatulated home after a big day at work. Or you might say, may I absquatulate myself from the dinner table, Mum? You could try that out tonight when you've finished eating, perhaps. Absquatulate. Fun to say, very useful as well. That is today's word of the day. I haven't really said this before, but shout out if you would like to nominate word of the day one day. Feel free to text through what our word of the day for tomorrow should be. 0467 922 917 is the text line. Just recapping as well, if you've just jumped in the car and haven't quite caught up yet, the Premier, Peter Gutwein, gave a coronavirus update earlier this afternoon. The message basically for South Australians considering travel to Tasmania is don't come. Anyone who's arrived from South Australia since November the 7th is required to self-isolate until they've been in the state for 14 days. And a mandatory 2-week self-isolation will continue for all arrivals from South Australia, either in a suitable residence or a government hotel. Also, for travellers who visited the following locations, you're being asked to call the public health hotline to arrange COVID testing. I'll be back to you in just a moment. The places are Lyell Human Hospital between November the 13th at 5:30 and November the 14th at 8 o'clock in the morning. Aquadome Aquatic Centre on November the 14th between 11 and 3:30, and Woodville Pizza Bar between November 6 to 16. And the public health hotline to arrange testing if you have been to any of those places is 1800 671 738. Coming up on tomorrow's program, Luke Martin, CEO of the Tourism Industry Council of Tasmania, will be joining me to answer some of the concerns that you might have heard earlier today that the council isn't catering for small tour operators. Tune in tomorrow for that and more. Right now, though, stay tuned to get the very latest news. It's 6 o'clock.
Your afternoon.
I love it here. The scenery is so beautiful and it's so calming, and there's something about this place that is just so awakening spiritually. I love it. It's sacred.
Weekdays on ABC Northern Tasmania.
ABC News. Good evening, I'm David Robertson. South Australians are being urged not to come to Tasmania. Chris Rowbottom has more.
A growing cluster of COVID-19 cases in Adelaide has led Premier Peter Gutwein to issue simple instructions to South Australians.
My message to South Australians who are thinking of travelling to the state at the moment is don't come.
Those South Australians who are already here are being asked to remain in self-isolation for 14 days. That applies to anybody who has arrived in the state from South Australia since November 7. The Premier also urged any recent arrivals who had attended the Lower McEwen Hospital in Adelaide, the Aquadome or Woodville Pizza in recent days to contact Public Health. South Australia remains at medium risk level.
Meanwhile, the Federal Tourism Minister is warning that the COVID-19 outbreak in Adelaide could have a devastating impact on the tourism sector across the country. A cluster of coronavirus cases there has now forced South Australian authorities to impose a statewide 6-day lockdown. Senator Simon Birmingham says that will make Australians wary about planning any travel.
It means that we're going to see a devastating impact, I suspect, on confidence to travel and to move across the country. That there's significant disruptions to people's plans and bookings just as that confidence was re-emerging.
The New South Wales gaming regulator has blocked Crown from opening the new Barangaroo Casino in Sydney next month because of concerns over money laundering. More from Jean Kennedy.
The regulator has delayed a decision on whether to allow Crown to open its brand new Barangaroo casino next month after the gaming giant admitted for the first time that money laundering was likely occurring within its high roller gaming at its casinos in Melbourne and Perth. The regulator's chair, Philip Crawford, says the surprise admission has come at the 11th hour.
And that gives us great concern because we talk about money laundering, and what does that really mean? It means basically dealing with the proceeds of crime in an appropriate way.
He says any decision on granting the gaming licence at the Sydney Casino will be delayed until the inquiry's report is handed down in February.
A 30-year-old Northwest Tasmanian man has been jailed for 5 years for 8 family violence offences. Earlier this year, Bradley Lawrence Michael G was found guilty of a series of assaults against his partner between 2018 and 2019. These include kicking and hitting her, locking her and her 3-year-old son in a dog cage and spraying them with water and dragging her along the ground. In sentencing, Justice Robert Pearce said G's conduct was especially cruel and demeaning and has caused the complainant significant trauma. G will be eligible for parole after 3 years. 2 people have been charged after an alleged attack involving a chainsaw in Tasmania's south. Damien McIntyre reports.
A 59-year-old man was taken to the Royal Hobart Hospital and treated for a wound to his arm after the incident at Middleton near Woodbridge. Police allege the man's neighbour attacked him with a chainsaw about 20 past 10 last night. A 55-year-old man and a 52-year-old woman have been charged with committing an act intended to cause grievous bodily harm. They'll appear in court at a later date.
The British government has revealed plans to invest in a new green industrial revolution and impose a ban on the sale of nuclear powered entirely by fossil fuels from 2030. The BBC's Roger Harriman reports.
2040 was the government's original date for ending the sale of new cars powered by fossil fuels. That's now shifted to 2030, giving the UK what's thought to be the second most demanding target in the world. The government will invest heavily in the car charging network, and the subsidy for buyers of electric cars will continue. Much of the government spending is concentrated in old industrial areas. There's cash, for example, for new clean energy hubs in the northeast, specialising in wind turbines, hydrogen production and storing carbon emissions underground.
And Cricket Australia says the first test of the summer between India and Australia in Adelaide will go ahead despite South Australia's 6-day lockdown. The first test is due to begin on December the 17th. Tasmania's weather, a strong wind and rain for southwestern coastal waters from southeast Cape to Low Rocky Point. Fine and partly cloudy, northwest to northeasterly winds. Burnie and Devonport tomorrow, partly cloudy 10 to 20. It's currently on 16 degrees. In Launceston tomorrow, partly cloudy 10 to 26. It's now on 18 degrees. And in Hobart tomorrow, possible light shower 10 to 23. It's now on 21 degrees. You've been listening to ABC News.
Prices of properties in coastal areas in regional Australia are climbing, and demand for rental properties is outstripping supply. Today we're going to look at what's been dubbed the Vespa effect.
There's been some places I've driven up to, and the last place I went to, the lineup was 4 houses down. So there's just so many people, and there's a lot of couples, and I just get disheartened sometimes and think, is it even worth me looking through?
And we head to Fraser Island off of Queensland, where a bushfire, which has been raging for a month, threatens its unique ecosystem.
Bandicoots, rats, all those smaller animals, we'll probably lose goodness knows how many, and that could have a long-term effect on the dingoes who prey on those animals.
I'm Sinead Mangan, and this is Australia Wide. But firstly, South Australia will be locked down for 6 days from midnight as authorities look to curb the COVID-19 outbreak in Adelaide. People will be restricted from going outside of their homes. Even outdoor exercise and walking the dog are banned, and wearing a mask outside will also be compulsory. The state government is closing all schools except for students whose parents are essential workers, and aged, disability and residential care will go into lockdown. There have been 2 new cases linked to the Parafield cluster, taking the total number to 22, and there are further 7 suspected cases. South Australian Premier Stephen Marshall says the moves are drastic but vital.
We are going hard and we are going early. We need a circuit breaker to stay ahead of this. As of midnight tonight, we need our community to pause for 6 days. A series of wide-ranging restrictions will be implemented to significantly reduce mobility in the community to stamp out this virus.
The Premier of South Australia, Stephen Marshall. South Australian Police Commissioner Grant Stevens says masks will be required in all areas outside the home and supermarkets will stay open.
Takeaway food will be shut. Universities will be closed. Pubs, cafes, coffee shops and food courts will be closed. Elective surgery, except for urgent operations and cancer treatment, will be closed. We are closing open inspections and auctions for real estate. We're also closing all outdoor sport or physical activity.
You're listening to ABC Australia Wide.
And you're with me, Sinead Mangan. Fraser Island off Australia's eastern Queensland coast is the largest sand island in the world with its own contained ecosystem. But now that's under threat from a large bushfire that's been raging for more than a month. Waterbombing aircraft have been brought in, but animal advocates fear what the long-term impact will be. Joanna Marie has the latest.
The bushfire on Fraser Island was started by an illegal campfire and in 4 weeks has torn through more than 30,000 hectares of national park. There are fears many native animals have perished.
So we're going to lose a lot of reptiles, we'll lose a lot of the smaller mammals, probably echidnas, and although they tend to dig, bandicoot, rats, all those smaller animals, we'll probably lose goodness knows how many. And that could have a long-term effect on the dingoes who prey on those animals.
Cheryl Bryant from the group Save Fraser Island Dingoes says she hopes the wild dogs and their pups have escaped.
We are concerned, possibly not as much for the dingoes at this stage because the pups should be old enough to avoid it, and the dingoes, as we know, are pretty intelligent animals. But we're more concerned about the long-term effects, how this will affect the flora and fauna further down the track, because the island is a contained ecosystem, and if there is any major disaster, well, then there can be consequences later on, and I guess that's what we're concerned about. And also, the smaller animals that can't avoid the fires. I mean, we've obviously lost a lot of vegetation and a lot of wildlife.
Waterbombing efforts began this week with a large air tanker repeatedly dropping 10,000 litres of water on the fire front. But the danger isn't over yet. Rural Fire Service Queensland Regional Manager Peter Hollier.
Ultimately, if we can't pull it up where it's currently burning, there is a potential for it to move further down in the coming weeks towards Happy Valley itself.
With a fire like this that's been burning for so long, is it really a case of you need rainfall or a big lot of rain to put this fire out?
Rain's always welcome. We'll never knock back rain, but it is a large quantity of rain. Over 30 to 50 mils of rain that'll make a substantial difference. So when we're firefighting on the ground with the type of vegetation and also the soil being sand that we're using, it doesn't retain moisture. So as you can appreciate, an area that we've dampened down that may have just been smouldering, we put water on it, come back 5 minutes later, it's going again. So that's just one of the complexities of doing with fires and that vegetation type.
The manager of Cathedrals on Fraser Holiday Park, Jack Worcester, says 4 fire crews and 15 Queensland Parks and Wildlife units have been fighting the blaze, which reached their driveway overnight.
So yeah, it's just slowly getting closer. The real danger is if the winds pick up and it's not there itself. So even though it's still some distance away, we've still got to be prepared.
Conditions have eased slightly today with some light rainfall. Queensland Parks and Wildlife Ranger Regional Director Mick Cubis.
The incident management team has aerial surveillance being undertaken this morning and will formulate further plans for management over the coming days. This may include waterbombing activities and trying to secure further fire lines.
As for the flora and fauna, the full impact of the fire on the island's ecosystem won't be known for some time.
Well, I hope that they're going to monitor it and not, just assume everything will return to normal. that's something we, as we say, we can't foresee what's going to happen. It just depends how much is burnt out and how much of the wildlife is affected, and that needs to be monitored after the fires have actually been put out. But as far as I know, they're still raging.
Joanna Marie reporting there about the fire that's burning on Fraser Island off the coast of Queensland. And there are concerns for another major part of our ecosystem affected by bushfire. We've heard about the millions of animals that were lost in last summer's bushfires, but another big casualty of those fires were bees. Millions of bees, both wild and domesticated, also died after prolonged exposure to smoke or after their hives were burnt. They play a crucial role in pollinating our nation's food supply, so their survival is critical. A New South Wales mid-north coast couple who lost many of their hives have started a GoFundMe page to help beekeepers around the country get back on their feet. Jessica Clifford has this story.
Anna and Sven Martin have raised and distributed
I don't think they're hungry at the moment.
Beekeepers around the country since last summer. The couple had originally planned just to help other beekeepers in their area, but quickly realised no one else was coming to the rescue, and many keepers needed help.
Together with a couple of the other beekeepers that we knew in the area that some of them had been affected, we kind of thought, well, let's just get it on up and running, because first of all, we thought, even if the government can help, by the time the help gets organised and gets underway, it will take a long time, and then that project will include all the hobby or amateur beekeepers, and yet, there's so many of them, and the bees are not necessarily anywhere.
The pair gave thousands of dollars to hobby beekeepers who needed new boxes and queens for their hives. They also helped commercial beekeepers who lost most of their business assets. In Mogo, on the New South Wales south coast, Peter McGann is a full-time keeper, and as fire approached on New Year's Eve last year, he didn't think twice about getting his bees to safety.
Me and my oldest son Tom, we just worked from 6 o'clock in the morning till midnight, just feeding beehives on a trailer because it was the only way we could do it, to save them. We had to move them through daylight, like through the daytime, where we normally don't move bees. We load them at duck in the day, but we only move them at night when they're not flying. So in this case, it was just a matter of trying to save what material we could and what bees we could. So you a lot of bees behind it, just had no choice.
Mr McGann lost his home in the fires but managed to save most of his hives. Almost 12 months on, he has started producing honey again, but says it has not been easy. He ultimately lost 30% of his hives, most of them to prolonged smoke exposure.
When you get smoke like that over a long period, it affects the queens in your hives, and hives that survive a bushfire are still initially going to be weaker than they should be after the fire. So re-queening become a big issue within the apiaries after the bushfire ran through. We'd saved most of our bees, most of our hive material, and some have burnt, but
And while Mr McGann's bees have been receiving round-the-clock loving care, many of Australia's native bees weren't so lucky. Millions of hectares of bee habitat around the country burned during the fires, and native bees who nest in trees were unable to flee. Mrs Martin says after years of drought, then fires, the losses are uncountable.
I don't know how we could even start calculating how many hives perished in the fires, and then the fact that those trees that burned will recover eventually, but how long does it take until those trees recover to a situation where they start flowering again? And if the hives that were around there all perish, how quickly can native populations kind of come back to that area?
The New South Wales Apiarists Association estimates a third of the New South Wales bee population alone was wiped out last summer. While spring rain has been helpful in New South Wales, experts agree it could take up to 20 years for bees to fully recover from some of the hardest years on record.
Jessica Clifford with that story.
You're listening to Australia Wide.
I don't want to put a killjoy on their fabulous family tradition, but that was just mayhem and chaos, and the majority of them are still buying the trees, regardless of the thing.
So this is the first time we've opened the slide this summer.
On ABC Radio.
When it comes to movements in property prices, Sydney usually dominates the discussion. But the COVID-19 pandemic has seen the focus shift to regional areas, particularly in New South Wales. Prices in areas like Coffs Harbour and Byron Bay are climbing, and demand for rental properties is outstripping supply. Melissa Martin has this story.
From sales to rentals, property is hot in regional New South Wales. It's been dubbed the Vespa effect.
These are virus escapees seeking Central Australia, and they are streaming out of capital cities, streaming out of Sydney at the moment, looking for their very own Bonnie Doon escape.
Councillor Amanda Sinclair and her partner have realised a long-held ambition for a quieter life away from Sydney.
And COVID hit, his work went online, and we were able to make it to Wollongong and live our dream.
The couple weren't sure how the experiment would turn out, but so far it's working.
My husband originally, when we first moved here, he said, I don't want to get stuck in Wollongong. And we were here for 2 weeks, and he said, I love it. I don't want to ever move. I love Wollongong.
There's been a huge shift towards regional New South Wales, according to the areas with the highest growth in property settlements in the last month. The Central Coast leading the way, followed by the Wingecarribee Shire and Shoalhaven. The Coffs Harbour Grafton region on the state's mid-north coast has experienced the strongest property price growth in the 3 months to September 2020, with the quarter-on-quarter median sale price up 8.7%, according to realestate.com.au, and rental vacancy rates have fallen to below 1% in many regions. Coffs Harbour real estate agent Mark Webb.
Some of our open houses, we're getting 30, 40, 45, 50 people through. Applications, we can take between 10, 15, 20 applications, and this is putting pressure on rents, which are increasing as well at this point in time. In 24 years, I've never seen it like this on the Coast Coast in the time I've been in real estate.
And that is leaving some renters out in the cold. Single mum Kelly Goff has been looking for a rental home in Coffs Harbour since March.
There's been some places I've driven up to, and the lineup, the last place I went to, the lineup was 4 houses down. So there's just so many people, and there's a lot of couples, and I just get disheartened sometimes and think, is it even worth me looking through?
Ms Goff and her 3 children are temporarily living with a friend while she looks for something permanent. But she says it's getting harder.
Very disheartened. Some days are a huge fight to stay positive and to keep going. And after you get so many rejections, it can take a toll. But then you've just got to pull yourself up and keep going.
The rising property prices and shrinking rental availability could put at risk the lifestyle city dwellers are moving to secure.
The danger is that when a coastal town or a tree change community is swamped by city escapees bidding up property values, you get what I call the Manhattan effect. This is where people are priced out of the local area.
The sudden pressure on housing has the state government looking for a fix. The New South Wales budget has announced the construction of 1,300 new social housing homes, 45% of those in regional areas. But Housing Minister Melinda Pavey says public housing is only part of the solution.
It is a challenge that we have to address and look at and work with all sectors of the economy, whether it's our recreational home caravan parks, whether it's our aged care providers, land and housing, or our community housing providers, or even just looking at some of our planning and encouraging more land release.
No one really knows how long the regional property boom is going to last, but most agree that solutions are needed so the hottest locations don't become victims of their own success.
Melissa Martin reporting there from Coffs Harbour in New South Wales.
You're listening to Australia Wide.
Emu fact for Emu Ward.
Not being able to play cricket properly would be a real shame.
She is a legend, and I like to work with her all the time.
Particularly me, I really enjoy cricket.
On ABC Radio.
Low aromatic fuel is an unleaded petrol that has been designed to discourage people from sniffing by lowering the amount of the toxic aromatic components which make someone high. Petrol sniffing can cause a number of serious health impacts, including brain damage or death, and the fuel is available in remote parts of Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia and the Northern Territory, in places like Ireland Land and the WA Goldfields. Now, the major refiner of low aromatic fuel, and this is one that's called Opal Fuel that's produced by BP, is shutting its refinery in Kwinana in Western Australia. The closure of the refinery after 65 years means 600 jobs will be lost, but it also leaves this question of where will this low aromatic fuel be refined. Premier Mark McGowan has told Parliament in Western Australia that BP is in talks with Viva Energy in Geelong to ensure the fuel continues to be produced.
I think it's a very good point. We'll continue to work with BP on that issue, but I'm very confident that they will deliver on that matter.
That's Western Australia's Premier Mark McGowan. Dr. Peter Dance is an honorary fellow specialising in substance misuse studies at Menzies School of Health Research. Now, Dr. Dance, how important is it that there is no break in the supply of low aromatic fuel to remote communities?
Well, it is vitally important. The contribution of low aromatic fuel since it came in 2005 to reducing levels of petrol sniffing across, particularly in remote communities across Australia, has been very significant. It's of course not a total answer, but it's been a very important factor in the marked reduction of petrol sniffing that has taken place. And I don't think there's any doubt that if that program, the low aromatic fuel program, were to be jeopardised, then there's a real danger that we could see a return to the really quite alarming conditions that were around 15 years ago.
A University of Queensland study last year found that the fuel led to a 95% decrease in petrol sniffing in communities. I mean, they're massive figures. How has that changed life on community?
Well, it's changed, and it's important not to overstate it because there are a number of communities that still have problems with petrol sniffing and other volatile substance misuse. But the biggest change, I think, is that many of these communities were in a state of almost constant crisis. Even if there were not a large number of people, and a small number of people could do an enormous amount of damage, not only to themselves, and in some cases fatal damage, but also to their families and to the communities. And people who could recall what conditions were like in some of those communities at that time will tell you, as that report demonstrated, that self-harm, harm, vandalism, all of these things were happening on a very widespread scale. And yes, there has been an enormous change in that respect.
What are the drawbacks of low aromatic fuel as a weapon, I suppose? No, the weapon's probably the wrong word, but as an instrument for change.
I think it's not so much drawbacks as limitations. I think we can genuinely say there are no drawbacks.
What is it?
Strategy for dealing with a drug problem, which this is, it's got its limitations. So, low aromatic fuel is a necessary condition for dealing with petrol sniffing, but on its own, it's not a sufficient condition. You do need other measures to try to reduce the demand, whether that can include recreation use programs, other programs to sort of enhance the opportunities available to young people. And you also need ways of treating or dealing with people who do, as it were, fall through the cracks and who are still engaging in petrol sniffing or other volatiles.
Are you confident that the government will sort this problem out prior to the Kwinana refinery being closed down?
Yes, I'm reasonably confident, I am confident. My understanding is that the Commonwealth Government has entered into contracts for the supply, the ongoing supply of low aromatic fuel, and although yes, there is a logistical problem if one of the main refineries is no longer producing it, but those contracts are there. They're fairly recent, and I don't think there's any reason to suspect they won't be honoured.
Dr. Peter Dance from the School of Health Research. Thanks for talking to Australia Wide.
Thanks, Janelle.
This is ABC Australia Wide.
Now, Australia Wide did get in contact with BP and they gave us a statement which said BP will work closely with the state and federal governments to ensure that supply of opal fuel continues uninterrupted following the closure of the Kwinana refinery and into the future. BP has a number of potential options for supplying opal fuel, including working with Viva, which already produces and supplies low aromatic fuel in Australia. It remains committed to supporting Indigenous communities across Australia and understands the positive impact low aromatic fuel has. They also added that BP currently produces opal fuel at Kwinana for WA in South Australia, and that the low or aromatic fuel is produced at Viva refinery already in Geelong, as well as at Kwinana, and low aromatic fuel can also be produced and imported from various international locations.
ABC Australia Wide.
Each year, the National Film and Sound Archive collects 10 recordings to be played in the Sounds of Australia registry. It's a collection of sounds that have had a defining impact on Australian culture, and this year's list has sounds precious to almost every generation. Because I Love You by the Masters Apprentices, Tomorrow by Silverchair, the opening ceremony recording of the 1956 Melbourne Olympics, and Aboriginal dance songs from Ireland Land are part of the collection. John Williamson's 1986 classic True Blue is another song that captures a moment in time in Australia's history, and it's a track that draws heavily on quintessential Aussie slang and was the soundtrack to the Australian Made campaign. The National Cricket and Rugby Union teams even adopted True Blue as an unofficial team song, and here it is.
Hey, True Blue, don't say you've gone. Say you've knocked off for a smoker, and you'll be back later on. Hey, True Blue, hey, True Blue, give it to me straight, face to face. Are you really disappearing? Just another dying race. Hey, True Blue, True Blue, is it me and you? Is it Mom and Dad? Is it a cockatoo? Is it standing by your mate when he's in a bind? Or just Vegemite? True Blue, I'm asking you.
John Williamson's 1986 classic True Blue, which joined the National Film and Sound Archive today. And that's Australia Wide for this Wednesday. If you want to listen back on a programme, remember you can go to the ABC Listen app and subscribe to Australia Wide. I hope you have a lovely evening. Cheerio.
Hello, welcome to PM. I'm Linda Mottram. Tonight, 6 days of tough lockdown set to begin in South Australia. We'll hear from those who are scrambling to beat the midnight shutdown and ask whether the measures are necessary. Also, the Northern Territory government gets itself into a mess, scrambling to deal with an influx of cross-border arrivals.
The system last night was put under pressure. We then had plans that we had made not go to plan. We had a bird strike to a plane which stopped 80 people from being chartered out of Alice Springs. We had hotel rooms that we previously thought we could count on suddenly not become available.
And the opening of Crown's waterfront Sydney casino is blocked over money laundering concerns. South Australians are facing what could be the toughest restrictions in the country in response to any coronavirus outbreak so far. The extreme measures come into effect from midnight, so for the next 6 days, people by and large will not be able to leave their homes as health authorities try to slam the brakes on what they say is a fast-spreading strain of the virus. The Premier says it's the circuit breaker the state needs to stop the second wave. To Adelaide First tonight is our reporter Caroline Winter.
Premier Stephen Marshall didn't beat around the bush in announcing harsh new restrictions.
No effort is being spared to stamp out this virus in our state. We're going hard and we are going early. Time is of the essence and we must act swiftly and decisively. We cannot wait to see how bad this becomes.
He says health authorities have the chance to stop the virus from spreading and stamp out the Northern Adelaide cluster. 2 cases revealed today have increased the cluster to 22. There are another 7 suspected cases. Thousands of close contacts have been quarantined. Thousands more South Australians have been tested. But the Premier says anyone potentially infected needs to be isolated and contact tracers need a circuit breaker to be able to do their job.
We have caught this cluster very early. We know where the links to this cluster are. We have an opportunity to stop the spread of this disease and to stamp out this cluster. We need the opportunity to identify and isolate the close contacts so that they aren't out circulating the virus further.
From midnight, only 1 person per household will be able to leave their home once a day for essentials like groceries or medical reasons. All schools will close except the students of essential workers, and aged care will go into lockdown. Cafes, pubs, takeaway and restaurants will also shut, along with the construction and real estate industries. Outdoor sport and exercising outside of the home is banned and elective surgery will stop. There will also be no weddings or funerals. Essential services, though, will stay open, including supermarkets, medical clinics, public transport and utilities. And South Australian Police Commissioner Grant Stevens says masks will be mandatory.
People will be restricted from going out of their house for a 6-day period. The message is stay at home unless you are accessing essential services or you are an essential worker.
He says they expect people to do the right thing and will take action if not.
I must admit this is something that we didn't anticipate. It's something that we've got contingencies in place for, but I think it's important that we take these steps to ensure that we can support SA Health as much as possible to eradicate this virus.
Contact tracers are working around the clock with help from New South Wales and the Commonwealth. But this COVID strain, the Chief Public Health Officer says, is highly contagious, has a short incubation period and has mild or no symptoms. Nicola Spurrier says it's only taking 3 days for one positive case to pass infection to another. She says they've now traced back to the 5th generation.
The reason for going for this 6-day period of really significant restrictions is that 2 generations. As I said, we're up to the 5th and then we'll be getting up to the 6th. We don't have any time to wait. If I just thought about this all day and then told the Police Commission, the Premier tonight, we would already be that 12 hours behind.
She says they've gone for a different strategy than Victoria and is confident it's the right decision.
I know this is an absolutely big ask, but if we leave this any longer and if we have people moving around the community and having a lot of contact with other people, then we're going to be in this for the long haul and we will be like the experience in Victoria, where we get increasing cases every single day and we have to go into a significant lockdown for a very long period of time to snuff it out.
At this stage, the tough restrictions are in place for 6 days with a view to relaxing them for another 8. But Police Commissioner Grant Stevens says anything can happen.
I'm confident, based on the advice we've been given, that we are doing this for 6 days and then we are moving into a period of significant restrictions, but not to the same extreme level that we're talking about now. We are aiming for that, but as with everything we've said about COVID-19, we don't control this virus. We're doing the very best that we can to manage it and to eradicate it from our community. But if we need to take other steps to keep on top of this, then that's what we'll have to consider.
South Australia's Police Commissioner Grant Stevens, Caroline Winter, our reporter there. And Caroline has headed out since sending that report to Adelaide's eastern suburbs. So let's find out what the scene is like there. Caro, what's the public reaction you're seeing to these very strict restrictions?
Well, Linda, it's been a
say that some people are confused, some are a bit stressed, and there's definitely an anxiousness in the air. I'm at a shopping centre here. There's about 50 people lined up to get into the supermarket. It's snaking its way around from the front door, around the corner inside the shopping centre, and then out onto the footpath. There's also lots of security guards around keeping an eye on things with concerns that people might get out of control. Earlier I did pop into the supermarket rather. I found that trolleys were brimming, shelves were stripped bare, things like toilet paper, fruit and veg, bread, meat and frozen food no longer existing inside, although I did find a few bottles of hand sanitizer, interestingly enough. The run on the supermarket is despite the fact that they will stay open over the coming days, and police have urged calm, but hundreds have headed out regardless. I think just fearing that they probably can't leave their homes for the days. Interestingly, people here are wearing masks, probably about 10% of who I've seen. That'll be mandatory, as we know from tonight, but it's been an unusual sight in Adelaide, so people are taking heed of that message. Now, I spoke to some shoppers here a short time ago about how the new restrictions will affect them and whether they think they're needed.
A bit frustrated, but I know what needs to be done to keep the state safe, so I'm happy to go ahead and do the 6 days that we need to do.
How's it going to impact you and your family?
We have 3 children, so we'll be stuck at home with 3 children, and we will both be working from home. So,
and we're obviously at the shops at the moment. Have you been inside and picked up a few things? What was it like?
It was okay. It was all organised and actually not chaotic at all.
I think we need to get onto this very, very quickly. And I think everybody needs to do what they need to do, which is why I'm actually wearing a mask before midnight. Before I wait till midnight.
I think the supermarket has been very helpful in actually letting people know that the supermarket will still open, so no need to panic, although we can see empty shelves here and there, but the reassurance from the supermarket is good, and it's good to see people generally follow what they have been asked to do, so I'm people are anxious to actually get what they want and then go home quickly.
Adelaide residents speaking there to our reporter Caroline Winter. One of Australia's foremost biosecurity experts is strongly backing the South Australian measures, and she says they will work. She's Professor Raina McIntyre. She heads the Global Biosecurity Program at the Kirby Institute and is a professor at the University of New South Wales.
I think the logic is the earlier you apply a lockdown, the more chance of success and the smaller the resulting epidemic. And I think it is justified for 2 reasons. One is they've had at least 6 generations of cases, which means there's quite a probability that it's more widespread than they've detected. And the second reason is we're coming to the end of the year with Christmas and New Year, which is going to be a high-risk period anyway, with more celebrations and gatherings and so on. And so it's really important to just get on top of this. And I think they've also looked at the experience in Victoria where they had a more measured approach, where they tried localised lockdowns first, locking down apartment buildings, suburbs, etc. And it didn't work. It got bigger and bigger and really got quite in Victoria. So I think they looked at that too and thought, okay, let's just bite the bullet and get onto this.
Circuit breaker. Is that what that means? Hit hard early and hope to just knock this out?
Yeah, it's to stop the transmission. So the transmission happens because people interact with each other, at the shops, at social events, in the households, etc. And the circuit breaking is stopping that interaction. It's person-to-person contact that is the risk. So when you stop all that contact and have a lockdown, you can stop the transmission.
And you mentioned they've had at least 6 generations of cases. How much more widespread could the virus be than what we've actually seen so far, which is 20-odd cases, I think?
It could be quite a bit more, particularly because they've also mentioned they're seeing asymptomatic cases and cases that are infectious with minimal symptoms, which means that if you've got people out there who are, have no symptoms but are out there in contact with other people, not realising that they're infected, then you can get a lot of transmission.
Now, the strain of the virus spreading very, very rapidly, Professor Nicholas Buria, the Chief Public Health Officer in the state, says. What do we know about that strain?
Well, I haven't seen any genetic data to suggest that there is a mutation or it's a different strain in any way, which some people have implied. What she has said indicates that, firstly, the time between getting exposed and developing illness is extremely short. That is the incubation period. The average incubation period for SARS-CoV-2 is 12 days, which is quite long. But in this case, they're seeing people exposed and ill within 1 to 3 days, which is very short. The one other explanation to that is just the dose of exposure. If people are exposed to a very high dose of virus, then their illness could come on sooner. The incubation period could be shorter. So it could just be that there's been, a super spreading event with very high doses of virus everywhere, and these people who got infected rapidly have been exposed to a higher than normal dose of virus.
Now, schools are going to be closed as part of this 6-day very tough shutdown. Is that wise? The schools has always been a controversy, hasn't it?
It has, but it's very clear that the virus does spread in schools, and you can't really get control of an epidemic without closing. Particularly high schools. Yes, primary school kids are less likely. The younger they are, the less likely they are to get seriously ill. Probably the young kids are getting infected, they're just not getting ill, and they don't tend to develop antibodies, so they don't mount an immune response to the virus. So when you test the blood test, they don't have antibodies. But it doesn't mean they're not spreading the virus.
And so in terms of South Australia's response, a lot of high praise for their response, for quick, efficient management from the start of this outbreak a few days back. But does this need for this hard lockdown indicate that that initial response wasn't so flash after all?
No, I don't think so. It's still pretty early days. If you compare Victoria, it took a longer time and a larger epidemic before the lockdown came into play. So I think they've actually intervened very early in this case.
And is it going to work? Can we be confident that this 6-day lockdown, this is the toughest we've seen anywhere yet, isn't it? Is it going to be effective?
Yes, it will work. There's one thing we do know about respiratory viruses: they behave in a predictable way. If you stop people having contact with each other, the transmission will slow down dramatically.
And how many more of these sorts of outbreaks are we likely to see over time? Is there any way of knowing?
But the pandemic today is much, much worse in the world than it was in March. So it's raging all around us in quite unprecedented levels. So we will continue to see outbreaks until the time when most people in the country are vaccinated with an effective vaccine.
Rhina McIntyre, thank you very much for your time today.
It's a pleasure, Linda.
Global biosecurity expert, Professor Rhina McIntyre. Well, the South Australian outbreak has quickly revealed vulnerabilities in the contingency plans of the state's neighbours. The Northern Territory government is being accused of allowing its Alice Springs quarantine system to fall apart after it was overwhelmed yesterday by South Australian arrivals. Jane Barden reports.
The NT Health Minister, Natasha Fyles, today faced the media on the defensive.
I want to reassure Territorians every step for clinical safety has been maintained.
In response to Adelaide's COVID cluster, on Monday morning, the Gunner government announced everybody arriving from South Australia would immediately have to go into its mandatory quarantine centres for 2 weeks. And by today, they'd have to start paying $2,500 for that. Caught unawares by a rush of people driving across the border to beat the payment deadline, its Alice Springs quarantine centre quickly reached capacity. Then an attempt to fly the 80 people over capacity from Alice Springs to mandatory quarantine in Darwin last night failed. NT Health Minister Natasha Fyles again.
We had a bird strike to that plane, which then stopped those plans. We also had previously arranged with hotels in Alice Springs that if we reached a point where we needed rooms, they would provide them. I'd like to thank those hotels that did, but it was disappointing to see some hotels that had previously agreed to that not provide rooms.
So the government suddenly decided this morning to allow some people who'd arrived in Alice Springs from South Australia, including this woman who doesn't want to be named,
to go home to self-isolate instead.
As I just saying, I see 80 people are getting put on this plane, but then when we were told, it's not happening, then more forms came out to see who could isolate at home.
Alice Springs resident Colin, who left hospital in Adelaide early after back surgery on Monday morning to get home before today's imposition of quarantine costs, is accusing the government of running a chaotic and unfair system. He had to sit on a bus for 4 hours in pain, waiting to find out if he'd still have to go into the Alice Springs quarantine centre where he is now.
It was chaos. I got released on the Monday. I tried to get an exemption form. I was told under no circumstances is there's going to be for people to be able to quarantine at home. I'm fine with that. Like, it's rules are rules. But then the very next day, I was told we're getting allowed out to go home and self-quarantine.
And what does it mean for your rehab being stuck in?
Don't know. I don't know. And I've got none of my aids or anything. I've got pillows underneath the bed. You get the curvature on the bed. The bed's on wheels. It's already slipped underneath me, and I've had a bit of a jolt in the floor. I've got an open wound on my back. I would like to go home. If people are allowed to get home to self-quarantine, I should be on the priority list.
The NT government's also today announced they're only requiring people who've arrived from Adelaide and surrounding suburbs to quarantine, and not travellers from the rest of the state. NT opposition leader Leah Finocchiaro.
There's clearly no plan, and the government are making this up as they go along. And it raises a much bigger question around what happens here in the Territory if something more catastrophic were to take place. Ultimately, we've seen the system fail just in response to closing one border.
Natasha Files is rejecting that and telling travellers rules will continue to change rapidly.
This highlights domestic travel is not what it used to be. This is what post-COVID travel is about.
The NT government is warning people who continue to arrive into Alice Springs from Adelaide. They are likely to be flown to mandatory quarantine in Darwin.
Jane Barton with that report. You're listening to PM on the radio, on the ABC Listen app and via the podcast. I'm Linda Mottram. Coming up, our China correspondent on the reaction in Beijing to Australia and Japan's promised new defence cooperation pact. The gambling giant Crown Resorts had lofty hopes of opening a third major casino in Sydney's Barangaroo early next year, but today it's been told that won't be happening. The New South Wales gambling regulator says it's not comfortable with the company operating the multi-billion-dollar revenue after a startling admission from the casino operator. It has said that it was likely that money laundering was occurring through accounts set up to handle VIP gaming in its Australian casinos. Our business reporter David Taylor has been following the story for you this afternoon. David, this decision surely would not have come as a surprise to Crown management or the board.
No, Linda, in fact, quite the opposite. This morning, the regulator, the New South Wales Independent Liquor and Gaming Authority, announced that Crown had made submissions overnight. In those submissions, it admitted that it was very likely that money laundering had occurred within its VIP gaming operations. Now, the hearing had previously been told Crown's board was unaware of the suspicious transaction activity. Commissioner Bergen was caught off guard though, Linda, saying that today council assisting had been trawling through bank accounts for the past 12 months, and if Crown had maybe given the evidence that it gave this morning, they wouldn't have had to do that, so understandably upset there.
Now, what have we heard actually from the Independent Liquor and Gaming Authority?
Well, look, they've got a shopping list of concerns about Crown. Crown has suggested there's maybe a limited opening of its Sydney